Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next in the series of ISE webinars. My name is Marina and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Shortly, I will pass over to Tristram Hooley, who will be talking about government regulations and recommendations, when, how the lockdown will end and what it means for the student recruitment. If you haven't taken part in our webinar before, welcome. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the question box in the software panel as we go along. And at the end of the presentation, I will feed them through to Tristram. We also record this webinar. You will be sent a link to the recording by the end of the day, so you can revisit the presentation and pass it along to your colleagues who may be interested. That's it from me. All yours, Tristram.
Great. Well, welcome to this. I'm going to be talking about we've got to get out of this place, student recruitment and the end of lockdown. So I don't know about you, but I'm certainly ready for lockdown to come to an end. I've been sitting in the back bedroom of my house, looking at the wall opposite for now quite a few months, and I feel like we should be about to sort of move out of this. But we've rescheduled this webinar a couple of times because we kept thinking that things were about to end a bit more decisively. And as I'll talk through, things have been a little bit slower to end than we might have thought in terms of lockdown. So what we're going to do in this webinar is spend some time just looking at the government's sort of position on lockdown, a bit about the kind of progress of the pandemic itself. But in particular, we're going to focus in on what are graduate recruiters doing, and particularly on speculating a bit about what the autumn might look like and beyond as people try to manage this. So that's really the focus of what we're going to be doing. One of the things that's been difficult about this is, so this is a screenshot that I literally took just before this started. So I took this at about 12 o'clock today. And in it says the Prime Minister is going to speak today. He's going to reveal some plans, and they're saying, The Guardian, unsurprisingly, is talking about pubs, restaurants, cinemas and museums, which is probably the things that Guardian readers think are most important. But what you can start to see, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, what you can start to see is that as you look across different news outlets, you can hear quite a lot of speculation about exactly what the Prime Minister is going to announce and when some of the rule changes are going to happen. But what we can be sure is that by the end of today, we will probably have some rule changes to lockdown, and exactly what they'll be, we will have to see. So this is what I'm going to cover. What is lockdown? What happens next? And then key issues for employers. So let's start with the lockdown. If we've cast our mind back, it really started in the middle of March. By the 23rd of March, we had the full lockdown. Boris Johnson came on and told us that we weren't allowed to go out and so on. And pretty soon after that, Parliament then voted to new legislation, which gave the government new powers to limit public freedom, which I think it would be fair to say that some of the powers that government has given itself, in any other circumstances, many of us would be extremely worried about. But in these circumstances, we've taken a sort of unprecedented step, given up some of our liberties, and allowed government to kind of lock us under tighter control than we would normally expect. Now, if you remember back, and this is when we probably first started talking about doing this webinar, back in April, the Prime Minister said, well, the UK has passed the peak and we're now on the way down on the coronavirus. And so that was really great news, obviously. And then on the 10th of May, I know I stayed in, even my children watched the television, and we watched Boris Johnson telling us that he was going to start the process of opening up and ending the lockdown. But I think most people were quite underwhelmed on that day about exactly how open it was going to be and how quickly it was going to move. And there was, quite a bit of confusion, which is then much has been now sorted out. On the 31st of May, there was new legislation published that legally changes the lockdown. But everything in this kind of opening up of the lockdown has not gone entirely according to plan. So where are we now? So this is my summary. There's a lot of detail. If you want to download, I mean, I've been in and read some of the key documents. There are pages and pages of documents aimed at different stakeholders. So if you're a school, you can look forward to downloading a kind of 600 pages worth of regulations about how you might organize different things. Businesses can find regulations and so on. So, but the sort of top level things are, we can now exercise when we want, we can drive, we can meet people in what's sometimes described as our bubbles, so immediate family and friends. Some people have moved back to work, but many are now either at home where they're working, or they're still furloughed, and the furlough scheme has been a very big shift that's been very important in terms of lockdown for business, but it's done what some people have described as mothballing the economy, so putting it on ice while we wait for the lockdown to end. We're now starting to see that the lockdown is ending, so the furlough scheme is going to be relaxed from August and then be phased out by the end of October. Some schools have opened, but teaching within the social distancing rules has proved pretty difficult. So I think the aim that the government had to get people back, or young people back into school before the end of this academic year, has not been fully realised, and it's been much more difficult. And so one of the questions will be what happens in the next academic year, so from the beginning of September in schools, or October perhaps in universities. Many shops have now opened, that's a much more recent attempt. So we've seen from the middle of June, non-essential shops being allowed to open. Not all of them have chosen to do this, and not everybody wants to shop, but obviously that is also starting to happen. And we can also travel on public transport with masks. So I think all of this really comes down to the fact that while we have seen considerable opening up from the kind of high point of lockdown, the social distancing remains as a key part of everybody's life, and it is making a lot of things very much more complicated. Now, just to remind us of this, when this lockdown was first set, the government introduced 5 tests, which they said they would use before they adjusted the lockdown. And so we've got these five tests, and I think there are 2 of them that it's still questionable whether the government has really met, or whether the country has really met. So the first is, has there been a sustained and consistent fall in daily deaths from coronavirus? Well, I'll look at some of the statistics in a second, but I think we would say that yes, that has happened, but there's still quite a lot of cases coming up, and it's still a bit, it's still a bit early to really feel that that's been fully met. And the 5th one is that, are we confident that any adjustments to the current measures will not risk a second peak of infections that overwhelms the NHS? And the answer is really no. People are not sure about that yet. There's a lot of debate and discussion about it. I'm not going to go into the kind of various people who are arguing different cases, but what we can be certain is that there's not a consensus nationally that it's completely the right time to open up. So some people are saying we're not opening up fast enough. Other people are saying we're opening up too fast, which is, why it is difficult for the government to try and make these decisions. When they first introduced this, they also set this alert level, and it's worth just having another look at this because it reminds us where we are. So we've just heard that the government has moved us to level 3, so that's good news. It means that the alert level has gone down. And what that means is that, yes, a COVID-19 epidemic is still in general circulation, so it's still going on, but it's not, if we look at the one above, it's not, transmission is not very high, it's not rising exponentially, so we're not seeing more cases every day, or an increasing number of cases every day. And so what they suggest is that we should start to gradually relax the restrictions and social distancing measures, and that is indeed what the government has been doing, and I would expect the Prime Minister to do more of today, and probably that process will go on slowly through the summer, and maybe continuing in the autumn. So what does this mean for graduate recruitment? Well, our research has told us that the kind of immediate impact on graduate recruitment has been a shrinking in the size of entry-level hiring by businesses. Large firms, that's been less extreme than for SMEs, who have found this period extremely difficult. But for graduates, we've seen about 12% reduction amongst businesses, about large businesses. For non-graduates, over 30%, and so on. So the first thing that we've seen is lockdown has interfered with people's recruitment processes and reduced the overall number of recruits that student recruiters are planning to recruit. We've also seen some quite big shifts in employer practices. Now, there's a couple of things that I'd like to point out here. So the first one here, so these are a series of different activities that would normally take place face-to-face. And so if we look at these, what employers are doing on all of these things, there's two bars that I'd really urge you to look at. So the first one is the pink one, which means things have been cancelled. And as you can see, across all of the different areas that we would normally expect recruiters to be active, we've seen them cancelling large amounts of all of these activities. Probably in many cases about half or more of the activities that they're running. So work experience, careers fairs, and so on. Over half of most of these things have been cancelled. And the other one that I'd really want you to look at, because we're going to come back to this, is online. And so the other thing that we're seeing, if they're not cancelling things, they are shifting them online. So just to say a little bit about this chart, this was a tick all that apply question. So these are percentages that we've got here, but it actually adds up to more than 100% because some people were ticking two options. But what we can see is that there's been a pattern in lockdown that, as well as the reduction in the size of the graduate labour market, the student labour market more generally, we've also seen a shifting of business processes. Firstly, to cancel things because the employers couldn't manage it, and latterly to then move things online. So that's where we are now, I think. So we've been through this kind of incredible social experiment that the government have taken us through in response to COVID-19. It seems to be working. We seem to be seeing quite a lot of reduction in the number of cases. It also, but it's had some very big and very worrying effects on the economy, which people are very deeply concerned about. So what's going to happen next? Well, let's start by having a little look at the cases. So what we can see here is this is the cases really throughout the whole of the period that we have been looking at, so from the end of February up until now. And this is the number of new cases a day. And what we can see here is a fairly normal distribution curve. I mean, it moved up more steeply than it's come out of the curve. And so what we've seen is kind of a rapid growth at the front end of this, then a sort of sustained number of new cases going on for probably about a month over April and May, pretty high level, and then starting to drop off pretty definitely when you look at it over the long period, starting to drop off. But as we can see at the tail end, it's not dropping off tremendously quickly. So if we just look at June, so I'll just blow up here so you can see it a bit more easily, what you can see is that, yeah, you'd probably say that there is a trend downwards in those numbers. June is seeing some reduction in numbers overall, but it's not that marked. So, we're going from 1,500 at the beginning to 1,000 at the end of June. We would hope, I think we all were hoping that the number of new cases would reduce more quickly than that. And so that's where we are. So the next big date is going to be the start of July. That's what the Prime Minister is going to announce today. And what we expect to see is the opening up of substantial bits of the economy. So we've got some examples here, the sorts of things people are talking about: hairdressers, pubs and restaurants, theme parks. We've got a couple of question marks around swimming pools. And then there are some other initiatives that we might see. We might see the growth of bubbles. We might say, the Prime Minister might say, well, actually, you can increase the number of people you can associate with. You can perhaps join with, 5 households rather than 2 or whatever. There's been a lot of debate over the last week or so about whether it's right to reduce the 2-metre guidance on social distancing to 1 metre. That's particularly important for businesses. If we think about some of these businesses that I've just described, say a restaurant, the difference between having a metre between each table and having 2 metres between each table might be the difference between profitability and running your business at a loss. So this is an important distinction. If the government feel that they're able to make it, there will then be people who say they've made the wrong decision, but it will have consequences both for the health and for the businesses. We're then seeing stuff around, campsites, hotels, more travel in the UK, with lots of people starting to think about summer holidays, and particularly the tourism industry lobbying pretty hard for that sort of thing. And then we've also got, of course, travel outside of the UK, which has become fairly recently actually more restricted. So that, while the rest of the lockdown has been eased, the travel outside of the UK has been tightened up a bit. Now, alongside all of this, we have the ongoing development of the track and trace strategy. And the big idea would be that whereas at the beginning of this pandemic, it was necessary to lock everyone and everything down, the idea would be that we're able to become more targeted and more precise. So I live in Leicester. We've just had an outbreak in Leicester. It's been well reported and identified. They've set up some new testing facilities in the park in near where I live, and so that's the kind of response that we would expect to emerge. We'd have more localized responses, so the whole country can move on, but we might see an individual city or area or business even locked down harder when a case comes out and it's seen to be spreading through that area. So this is the kind of strategy that we're seeing, and I think while the numbers continue to drop, we would expect the government to continue to move in this sort of direction. But of course, none of this is really back to normal, whatever normal is, and all of these changes will still have to work within amended social distancing rules. So we're not saying, nobody's saying that it's all just going to, in August, say everyone's just going to forget about all this and it's going to go away. Now, obviously, there are countries which have been more successful in controlling the outbreak than our country. So if you look in some of the Nordic countries, if you look in New Zealand, you can see examples of countries that have managed to control the number of COVID cases very sort of strongly. Even in New Zealand's case, almost getting it down to nothing. They've had a couple of small outbreaks since. But in that case, where it's pretty much nothing, people are moving, although still very tentatively, back to something approaching normal and dropping things like social distancing rules and so on. But we're quite a way away from that in the UK, I think, still. So the key thing, I think the key date for many of us working in student recruitment and student development is what will happen in September, October. So will we be back to normal, or will it be some kind of new normal? And I think there are a few things that are likely to be very important to that. The first will be whether schools are really able to go back, and the government's certainly saying that they should be. Whether universities are going to go back, and the universities are certainly saying that they'll be working. Many of them will be putting in place quite a lot of changes to their normal processes, so that it's unlikely that we'll see a lecture hall like this operating in the autumn, but it's very possible that universities will start doing seminars, we'll have students on campus, we'll reopen their careers services and so on, but within some kind of social distancing rules. Another key date from the point of view of our timetable is when people start to induct new staff. Well, that's happening already, but I think there's a real peak in firms inducting new entry-level staff in August, September, that sort of time. And we'll look a bit more in a second about what people are planning to do on that, but certainly it's clear that the induction processes are going to be more difficult than usual. And then one of the big key issues, which may not matter for all of our firms or all of our universities, but it might matter for us and a subset, which is the ability to travel internationally. And that's something which it's still not clear that is going to be working as normal by September. I know that I've certainly got a trip planned to Denmark in September, which I would love to be able to do, but I'm not that optimistic that it is going to go ahead. So with that in mind, what are employers planning to do? Well, the first thing that our survey tells us is that most or a very large proportion aren't sure yet, and that's really very strongly been endorsed by the conversations that I've been having with employers since we published this survey. Employers are looking forward to next year and about their recruitment, and they're juggling with different possibilities. So some are really not sure, some think, well, probably we'll recruit as we were going to, some less, some more, but there's enough fluidity in that the 2021 recruitment season, I think, is still wide open as to what sort of scale of recruitment it will be. We're certainly, I think, concerned that some employers may end this year feeling that they've slightly over recruited and therefore might turn their numbers down a little bit next year, but we'll see. What I have done is ask employers about their approaches to a number of those things that I talked about earlier, about that we'd seen change during lockdown. So these commonly face-to-face processes that we've seen here, employers talks, interviews, contributing to the curriculum and so on. And I've done a bit of analysis here which kind of tries to present what employers are going to do in a fairly binary way. So are they going to do things face-to-face or remote or some kind of combination? So what's that? And if it's not binary, is it trinary, tripartite? I'm not sure. But so we see, if we look at this from this point of view, what we can see is a really strong shift. Remember, most of these things are things that would be happening face-to-face normally in the old world. They're now mostly things that are happening either online or in a blended way. Now, there are some areas that we can see it's a bit more tricky to deliver that for. So work experience is one. We'll say a bit more about internships and work experience in a second. But there are others where actually people are pretty optimistic that they can shift this to being a online experience. So giving a talk that you might have got used to travel up the motorway to a university somewhere, you perhaps now think, well, we can just do that through Zoom. We're all pretty good at Zoom now. So we're starting to see a really important and serious shift of employers' business processes associated with student recruitment shifting online. So what about once people start? Well, I've flagged this idea of induction, and what our survey told us was that employers, about a third of employers are anticipating delaying the start dates for new hires. About half of them are thinking that they're going to be inducting new hires remotely. About 3/4 are saying they're now going to be doing learning and development activities online as well. And this little figure that I've got here just shows you if employers are planning to delay the start dates, when they're planning to delay it to. And as you can see from this, mostly people are thinking September, October, you know, they're just shifting it back a month or two to hopefully give them a bit more time to play with. But there are some who've said, actually, no, this is you know, it's too complicated to try and organize stuff for the autumn. We're going to shift dates back to January or earlier. early next year. So we've got a variety of different strategies that employers are using, but what employers are concerned about is that while they recognize that lockdown is opening up, the possibility of running induction processes and even having staff on site is not something they can be 100% confident they'll be in a position to do by, say, August or early September. And so we probably are expecting to lockdown to open up a bit slower than that. So this all leads us to some sort of depressing conclusions, and which is really about when will this all end. And what I've got here is this data from the World Health Organization, and it looks not at the UK cases, but at the worldwide cases. And so this is the number of new cases each day over the course of the last few months. And what we can see is that broadly, we're still on an upward trajectory. Now that might feel somewhat surprising to people because certainly in the UK, it feels very much like we have moved over the top of this peak and we're on the way down, and the thing is going away. And if you were to look in other European countries, that would probably be even more the case. But what we've seen is the shifting of where the epicenter of the pandemic is. And we're now seeing a lot of cases, for example, in South America, the pandemic moving into Africa. Some of those countries are not as able to record the data, but many of them are. And as we start to put it all together, the World Health Organization suggests that we've now had, well, almost 9 million cases over time across the world. And so what that means is that when people start to talk about a second wave, it's not really right. We're still actually very much in the first wave of this disease. We haven't seen it peak worldwide. It is still growing. Now, hopefully, we've seen it peak in Europe, and other countries or other continents will follow a similar pattern to Europe, but that is not a given. We may find that it moves around again and comes back. So I think there is good reason for government to be cautious in the way it opens up lockdown, and for all of us, in fact, to be cautious, businesses, universities, and us as individuals to be cautious in the way that we relate to this. So how are employers thinking about this going forward? Well, what I've got is really some insights that I've drawn out from conversations that I've been having with employers. If you follow the COVID briefings that I do each week, we publish them normally on Thursday mornings. You'll see that I normally put in a few insights that are drawn from employers that I've got from that week. And what I've done here is try and pull together some from maybe the last 6 weeks and put them together and to see where I think employers are probably going. So the first is on attraction. So that process of going out and finding students for your recruitment campaign, for your graduate program. How are employers going to manage this over the autumn into next year when they're thinking about managing this alongside some kind of level of ongoing lockdown? So, well, the first thing is that we expect to see a reduction of campus activities and direct face-to-face engagement with schools and colleges. Also to see an end to hard copy advertising. And many organizations are saying, well, it's just not worth sending stuff out to people because no one's in their offices. No one, we wouldn't expect lots of students necessarily to be hanging around on campus. So the shift to digital that I've already talked about is probably a very likely way that the attraction activities will look over the autumn. We're then going to see careers fairs and other face-to-face activities moved online. We also may see some firms delaying or cancelling their 2021 recruitment campaign. Many employers are telling us that their budgets are likely to be down, their businesses are under quite a lot of pressure following the lockdown. Obviously, it's been very difficult for many businesses. Even with the furlough scheme, businesses have lots of expenses. Very few have had a lot of money coming in over the last few months. The question for all of this is this permanent? Is this a temporary management strategy that we're seeing through the autumn, or is this something that is likely to extend? And that's something that I haven't got an answer to. My guess is that certainly some of it will continue. If we move on to recruitment and selection, what we can say is that decreased numbers overall look very likely in the kind of formal graduate labour market that the ISE is usually active in. We're therefore, I think, very likely to see increased numbers of applicants per vacancy, a shift to online interviews and assessment centres to manage these applicants. But some employers are asking, will these online approaches reliably deliver the candidates that are needed? And there's certainly going to be a lot of experimentation next year. And well, it's already started really. You know, what is going to be the difference in doing an online assessment centre rather than a face-to-face one? Will the online version firstly find the same students, or find students who are equally good at doing the job that you want them to do, but also will managers and hiring staff feel as confident with the people that they've got starting? Will they feel as bought into those decisions if it's been done online? These are all questions that we'll be finding out over the next year. And again, this question, will this be permanent? It seems very likely to me that things like assessment centres, that if we successfully shift these online and there aren't big problems with that, that is something which it will be very advantageous for employers to continue with. The next thing is induction. I've already talked about this a little bit, but most firms don't anticipate face-to-face induction will be possible this year, even if the lockdown has started to more convincingly end by the late summer, early autumn. People are preparing for virtual onboarding, and we're also starting to see the emergence of new tools and approaches for virtual onboarding and learning and development. And these things all raise some issues for how you actually manage these inductions. Remember, we're talking about people often starting their first job, never worked before, and we're expecting them to do it perhaps from the back room of their parents' house or their bedrooms. That's quite a challenging thing to absorb someone into your organizational culture. So I think this is an area where I would think employers won't be keen to continue with this more over the long term. Having said that, I think the shift to online learning and development is a long-term trend, and it's probably going to be accelerated by this. And I think if we were looking for a general principle, I think where the pandemic and the lockdown have accelerated long-term trends in recruitment and management of early career staff, we could probably expect that those trends will continue after lockdown. Where lockdown has forced us to do something that we never thought of before and we didn't think was the right way to do it, unless that's a tremendous success, it probably won't continue. We've also already heard that some employers are delaying inductions. They're hoping, and this is calculations that some employers, but as I said, not most, but some employers have made, they're hoping that by the time we get to Christmas, the lockdown will be over and we will be back to something akin to normal. Obviously, that's a risk calculation that people are doing. There's no absolute answer to that. Nobody knows really when the lockdown will end, but what we can say is that some employers think, okay, autumn, maybe not, Christmas, probably. So this gives you an indication of the way that different people are thinking about the kind of timescales that we're working to. In terms of how firms are managing staff, there are a few things that have come up in some of the discussions we've been having with employers that I think are worth discussing briefly. The first is that obviously many staff who are starting, either doing summer internships or who are already being inducted into graduate jobs, are doing so online. So there's not a lot of point in forcing those people to move, for example, to London or to wherever your head office might be. You can leave them in their parents' bedroom or wherever it might be until it's a bit clearer about when you can come into the office. Now, many employers have started to say, make that a bit more formal and say, well, look, if you're managing somebody who's a new entrant, you probably don't need to expect them to be coming into the office straight away. Even if we do start to open up, let's see how it goes before we start to get into a position where we're actually requiring people to move. And this perhaps opens up an interesting question, which again, people have been thinking about for a while, which is how important is it for people to be physically located in the same spaces, and how important is it for employers to bring all of their staff together into a single place. And so there's some issues in which it could potentially change the way that we work. We've also seen some interesting but worrying interpersonal conduct issues that have emerged in this increasingly online environment. Now we've got graduate cohorts interacting almost entirely online, student cohorts interacting almost entirely online. We are seeing the kinds of things that often schools and universities are worried about for a long while, like cyberbullying, online harassment, these kinds of interpersonal conduct issues that it may be important for firms to deal with, both in training and induction processes, but also in management and disciplinary processes as well. More fundamentally and related to the recession, we are, and this is not, I haven't got data on this yet, but anecdotally we're hearing a lot of stories that firms have held their salaries static, or that they've actually reduced salaries, and that even staff in post are not getting annual bonuses or year-end pay rises and that kind of thing. So we're seeing a number of issues that are going on in terms of the stagnancy of salaries, and that's going to be an important thing. And it's certainly something that we saw in the last recession, was while we didn't see employment fall dramatically in the last recession, we did see salaries stagnate, and it looks very possible that we may see both in this recession. We then also got some changes to diversity. So particularly the shift to online provision raises a number of issues. So employers have reported particular challenges in meeting the needs of disabled students, as many of the usual processes and adaptations are not easy to put in place when you're doing everything online, often with fairly kind of immediate tools that have been cobbled together rather than products that have been bought. This also opens up the issue of tech poverty and digital access as a new key dimension for diversity and inclusion that is likely to become more important if this shift online does persist. And I think finally, though, there are some positives. We could argue that the shift online has the potential to open up recruitment and attraction activities more widely and make them available to a wider cohort. So, for example, it's a way to get past that thing where some organizations only recruit from certain high status universities, but rather to say, well, actually, it's happening online, anyone can come, anyone who meets our requirements. I'm going to finish there, so if people have got questions, I'd love to hear them, and I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. But in summary, I think lockdown has definitely changed British society. The nature of lockdown is changing, but we're still rather a long way from an end, a full end. We're certainly seeing a loosening, but I think the end of lockdown is a little optimistic. The ongoing lockdown, pandemic, and the nascent recession are shaping the way that society will operate in the autumn and beyond. And student employers are adapting to these changes really quite quickly. And we would expect that at least some of these adaptations do end up becoming permanent. So I will finish there. Hopefully that's been interesting. It's very difficult to do this because inevitably we're always speculating about the future and we're trying to draw lines from trends in the past. But hopefully some of that gives you some insights that might be useful to you, either in your recruitment strategy or in supporting students to engage with student employers. But I don't know whether there are any questions.
Yes, we already had one question coming through. What sort of online careers fairs have you heard about so far?
So there are already many brands in here. I think one of the key dilemmas that employers are wrestling with is whether to work with national providers, perhaps linked to particular subjects or particular industries, or whether they're going to work with individual universities and to organise recruitment activities with individual universities in the way that they used to. Obviously, that makes a little bit less sense when you're not dealing with geographic. You don't have to travel to the University of Leeds or whatever. So there's not necessarily such a need to work with one particular university. So my sense, and I think it's very much up for debate, my sense is that a lot of employers are finding some of the national providers of online careers fairs quite appealing, and that if universities are keen to establish alternatives that are more linked to the institutions, they'll need to do that fairly quickly and come up with a good rationale for why employers might want to engage with just a single institution.
Great, thank you. Right, so the next question is from Ray. Sorry, bear with me for a second. Have employers expressed any views regarding postgraduate study? Would they advise students to do a master's next so they can apply when there are more roles and they're more qualified?
So employers, we ask questions about postgraduates quite often in our surveys. I haven't asked them in the COVID surveys particularly, but I've done it many times in the past, with a few exceptions where postgraduate degrees are a requirement or are very desirable, perhaps areas like engineering and so on. In most cases, employers are not tremendously interested in postgraduate degrees. Now, that doesn't mean postgraduate students don't do well, but there's not very many employers who will say, yes, we're specifically and only looking for people who've got a master's degree. And nor when asked, do people who have a master's degree, are they better workers? Employers don't tend to agree with that. They tend to say, well, not particularly. So on one level, I think from an employer point of view, there's no reason why you would be more appealing with a master's degree next year than you are with a bachelor's degree this year. However, if you were looking for a year to stay out of the labour market, then this year might not be a bad one. So I can well see that students might find the idea of doing a postgraduate degree quite appealing. And historically, we've always seen the number of applications for postgraduate degrees increase during periods of recession. So that idea of staying out of a labour market when things are very difficult and entering perhaps with more qualifications or perhaps with a bit more capital, a bit more experience is very desirable. What I would suggest is that if you were looking to maximise your employability, you probably would be looking for a master's degree that had a clear vocational pathway and one which had a strong work experience element or employer engagement element. But these things are very much questions of individual choice for students. But yeah, I think postgraduate study will definitely be a bigger feature of the landscape next year.
Thank you. Monica is asking, do we know which activities are the most popular for online assessment centres? Are employers still doing group discussion activities?
I think it's a bit of a mix, and I don't think we've got to the position yet as to how we haven't got to a standard yet. What I think employers are doing at the moment is they're trying to shift their previous face-to-face activities online as much as they can. Now, some we know have found group activities quite difficult to handle and have abandoned them, but many haven't, and they've reimagined them for an online environment. And so we've had some really interesting conversations on some of our employer town hall discussions where employers come together and share practice about how you're doing that and what's the best way to facilitate those things and how do you deal with all sorts of issues that might come up in that. So I think at the moment what we're looking at is a fairly straight transfer from face-to-face to online, and people are making changes where they're finding that difficult. My guess is that over the longer run, what we'll see is the emergence of clearer expertise, products, and patterns about how people are going to deliver that. And so we may see some changes over the longer run.
Thank you. Claire from Cardiff University is asking, do you have any thoughts on how we can manage tech poverty and digital access to support our students?
Well, it's quite interesting because so from the employer point of view, I think it can be very difficult. I think where employers are sort of understandably quite nervous is doing things like sending out laptops to people just who are in their recruitment processes but who they haven't got a contract with. I think that's quite unlikely that employers will do that. One of the things that many of them have been talking about is saying, well, isn't that really the responsibility of the educational provider? So if you're a university, you may well have a hardship fund, you may want to be providing ways for students to access technologies if, for example, their laptop breaks and they can't afford to buy a new one just as they're in the middle of a recruitment process. How are we going to manage that? So I think that is definitely something for universities to think about. I think in the longer run, these issues will become talked about much more. I think by the way I understand it, there are really 3 groups that we're talking about here, and the solutions is likely to be slightly different for each of them. The first one would be people who are too poor to afford the equipment that they might need. Perhaps they've found a way to manage through university, but once they leave the university, they don't have access to computing facilities or whatever. So we've got that group, or perhaps they have older equipment that can't handle whatever it is that your particular new technology might do. So that's one that's in a way is relatively simple because essentially it can be solved by throwing money at it. The second group are people who have challenges with Wi-Fi access, and that's normally associated with rural areas. But there are other areas that have poor Wi-Fi. That's a bit more tricky to think about how you solve because you can't lay new Wi-Fi for them. And then the third area are people with disabilities who might find accessing some of your online resources more difficult than they would have done if they were face to face, and if you had your normal adaptions in place. So I think they're some of the 3 ways that this issue will manifest, and we'll be exploring how that can be resolved with employers over the next year or so.
Great, thank you, Tristram. If you missed the start of the webinar, this session is being recorded and you'll be sent a link to the recording by the end of the day. You can also view all our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. That's it from us. Thank you, Tristram. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.